King Charles III and Queen Camilla's helicopter movements, what the palace travel signals. Picture a winter gray sky above London, the kind that turns the city into a charcoal sketch. The rooftops are still, the parks are quiet, and then, almost too quickly to process, a helicopter cuts across the air like a punctuation mark. For most people, it's just noise. A brief interruption, something you glance at and forget. But here's the detail almost nobody outside the corridors of power, in Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, or Berlin, fully understands. When King Charles III and Queen Camilla move by helicopter, you're not just hearing transport. You're hearing a message. Sometimes it's practical, sometimes it's security, sometimes it's the weather, but sometimes, quietly, carefully, it is the crown speaking in a language the palace has refined over centuries. Movement is meaning. And that's why tonight we're looking at something the headlines often treat as a footnote, yet insiders watch like a clock face. King Charles III and Queen Camilla's helicopter movements, what the palace travel signals. Two words keep appearing in the margins of this story, like a stamp you only notice once you know to look for it. Palace signal. Because the British monarchy has survived, not because it never changes, but because it knows how to signal continuity even while change is unfolding. Every movement, every journey, every quiet decision made behind palace walls is part of a system designed to protect something larger than any single person, the stability of the crown itself. And when we watch those movements carefully, we are not watching drama. We are watching history quietly doing its work. Now let's go closer, closer than the flight path, closer than the rotor wash, closer than the official diary. Because if you've ever wondered why one day you see the royal helicopter traced across the countryside, and another day you don't, if you've ever wondered why certain trips are made visible, and others feel almost invisible, then you're already asking the real question. What is the palace trying to communicate, without saying a word? And here's the first uncomfortable thought to sit with. In a constitutional monarchy, visibility is not vanity. Visibility is governance by symbol. So when the king moves, the institution moves with him. When the queen accompanies him, the institution doubles down on stability. And when the aircraft is a helicopter, fast, flexible, able to slip between estates and engagements, it becomes something else entirely. A tool that can compress distance and expand meaning. And if that's true, then the next question isn't about aviation at all. It's about timing. Because timing is where the story turns, and where the first cliff edge appears. If helicopter movements can look like mere logistics, why do they so often seem to appear at the exact moments when the monarchy most needs to look steady? Hold on to that. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. In public life, we're trained to watch speeches. We watch handshakes. We watch who sits where at dinners. But the most disciplined institutions don't only communicate in words. They communicate in choreography. The British monarchy is one of the last great choreographers of national identity. Not because it can command policy, but because it can embody continuity. And continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. When the king and queen appear somewhere unexpected, at speed, with minimal warning, it can create a feeling that the crown is everywhere at once. Not omnipotent, never that, but present. Responsive. Alive. Anchored. And in an era where public trust is fragile across many democracies, from the US to Germany, from the UK to Canada and Australia, presence itself becomes a kind of reassurance. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Now, we should be careful. Helicopters are used for very ordinary reasons. Security planning, time constraints, multiple engagements in one day, the need to avoid unpredictable road disruptions. The reality that a head of state, especially a high-profile one, creates an instant security event wherever they go. But the point isn't that every flight is a coded message. The point is that the palace understands what it looks like. And what it looks like matters. Because what it looks like becomes what it means. And that brings us to the first cliffhanger, the one that sits right around the 2-minute mark when viewers usually decide whether to stay or leave. So here it is. If helicopter travel is simply practical, then why does the palace sometimes let the public notice it, almost inviting attention, while at other times it seems to fold the movement into silence? What changes? And who decides? The answer lives at the intersection of tradition and modern crisis management, and it starts with something deceptively simple: the geography of the monarchy itself. Britain's royal system is not centered on one building. It's a network: Buckingham Palace, Clarence House History, Windsor, Sandringham, Balmoral, and more. Each place carries a different symbolic weight. Each place activates a different layer of national memory. A helicopter is the needle that stitches those locations together. And every stitch, whether we consciously notice it or not, reinforces the idea that the crown is continuous across space, across seasons, across political cycles, across personal transitions. Observers in the US and UK frame this moment differently, yet the continuity echoes across continents. In the US, people often read these movements through the lens of celebrity, security, and media optics: who's being seen, who's being protected, what's the story. In the UK, the instinct is more constitutional: what does this say about duty, about visibility, about national rhythm? Canada and Australia see this gesture as symbolic, but Germany interprets it as constitutional resilience. And what's remarkable is that all of those readings can be true at once, because the monarchy, at its most sophisticated, doesn't mind being interpreted in layers. It operates in layers. Now let's widen out for a moment. Because the pressure on King Charles III and Queen Camilla is unique. Charles came to the throne in a century where everything is recorded, clipped, replayed, compared, scored. His reign began not with a slow easing in, but with immediate expectation: steady the institution, honor the late Queen's legacy, and still prove modern relevance. That's not an emotional task. It's a governance task. And governance tasks require signals. So when the King and Queen move by helicopter, there's a second dimension beyond time and security: the choreography of continuity. The palace has to balance something delicate. Show too much, and you risk looking like spectacle. Show too little, and you risk looking absent. And absence is dangerous for a monarchy, because monarchy is partly a relationship with the public imagination. Not fantasy, relationship. A relationship has to be maintained. National identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. Even the choice of transport can become part of that ritual, because it creates a pattern: the king is seen doing the job. The queen is seen alongside him. The machine, the helicopter, becomes a modern extension of an ancient idea. The sovereign is mobile. The sovereign is reachable. The sovereign is working. But the story deepens when we look at how helicopter movements tend to cluster around three categories of moments. And this is where we get practical, because the pattern isn't mystical. It's structural. First, moments of compressed duty. There are days when engagements are stacked so tightly that the schedule itself becomes a statement: the crown is not slowing down. The crown is functioning. The crown is doing the work. Second, moments of geographic symbolism. Certain places carry constitutional memory. A visit isn't just a visit. It's a reaffirmation of union, of service, of connection to community. When the movement is swift, it can amplify the feeling that the sovereign is bridging distances within the realm. Third, moments of managed visibility. This is the one people sense but rarely articulate. Sometimes the institution needs an image of steadiness, particularly in periods when public debate is noisy, when family narratives are circulating, when political temperatures rise, or when the monarchy is being weighed and measured in a way that feels sharper than usual. And if you're thinking, so you're saying helicopter movements are basically PR, I want to pause you there, because this is where we have to be precise. It's not PR, in the shallow sense. It's signaling in the constitutional sense. The modern monarchy does not govern by decree. It governs its own legitimacy by consistency, restraint, and presence. That's why even something as mundane as a flight path can become meaningful. Not because it changes laws, but because it stabilizes perception. And perception, in this institution, is part of the architecture. Now, right around minute 4 to 5, when attention tends to drift, we need to bring the hook back, not as a gimmick but as a key. So listen closely. Palace signal. Say it out loud, and it sounds like tabloid drama. But if you treat it like an institutional term, like a quiet shorthand for how continuity is communicated, then it becomes something else. It becomes a way of reading the monarchy without cynicism and without naivete. Because the truth is, the palace has always signaled. In earlier centuries it was through procession, through carriage, through where the court resided, through who was received and when. Today, Part of that language is air travel. And that leads us to the second cliffhanger, sitting around minute 5. If movement is message, then what happens when the palace changes the pattern, when the rhythm of helicopter use shifts even slightly? Is it just logistics, or is it an institutional adjustment to something unfolding behind the scenes? Keep that question close, because now we move into the 3 clues, 3 ways to read what helicopter movements can suggest, without drifting into speculation, and without disrespect. Clue number 1, the presence of the Queen. In any monarchy, the consort's visibility matters, but it matters in a very particular way. Queen Camilla's role is not to compete with the king's constitutional position, it's to reinforce the human stability around it. When she is present, it can suggest cohesion, support, a steady partnership, not romance for the cameras, function for the institution. In the US, optics are often discussed bluntly, as the spouse helping the brand. In the UK, it's usually framed more gently, does the couple look united in duty? But the constitutional effect is similar. A united front is a stabilizer. And stabilizers matter most when the world feels unstable. So if you see the king and queen moving together, especially in moments where the schedule is intense, it can be read as the monarchy leaning into continuity through partnership. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Clue number 2, the choreography around media. Some royal movements are documented closely. Others are almost deliberately ordinary. You might see an arrival photo, a departure image, a brief clip, then silence. That variability is not accidental. It's management of emphasis. If the palace wants a visit to land as national reassurance, the imagery tends to be clean and readable: arrival, greeting, engagement, departure. A narrative of duty. If the palace wants a visit to be functional, important but not sensational, the coverage can be quieter. Less emphasis on the transit itself, more on the work. A helicopter can do either. It can be visible and dramatic, or it can be simply efficient. The difference is how it's framed, and what's allowed to be noticed. Clue number 3, protocol highlights, what is paired with the movement. A helicopter trip, on its own, is a vehicle choice. But when it's paired with certain kinds of engagements, it becomes a stronger signal. Commemorations, national moments, military affiliations, community resilience events, diplomacy-adjacent appearances, the kind of duties that connect the crown to the idea of the state, rather than the story of the family. Those are the moments where the monarchy's internal logic becomes clearest. National identity is woven into these rituals. And here's the subtlety. Sometimes the engagement is the headline, and the travel is merely the plumbing. But sometimes the travel itself, fast, direct, unmistakably official, adds a layer of seriousness, like the institution has decided that the appearance must happen, must be timely, must be seen. Now we're approaching minute 7 to 8, and it's time for the second rhetorical cliffhanger, one that doesn't rely on scandal, just on the tension that always exists in a modern constitutional monarchy. So ask yourself this: if the palace is carefully balancing visibility and restraint, what does it mean when helicopter movements make the monarchy look more modern, more mobile, more executive, at a time when many people are debating what the monarchy should be at all? Is the helicopter a tool of efficiency, or a symbol of adaptation? And if it's adaptation, what is the institution adapting to? Because that question takes us into the heart of the reign. Charles is often described as a man of ideas, environmental concerns, architecture, interfaith conversation, long-held interests that predate the crown. But as king, the job is not to be interesting. The job is to be continuous. And that means the institution must sometimes speak in a language that is instantly legible to the public. Movement is legible. A helicopter is legible. It says, the head of state is here, then there, then here again, without fuss, without delay. It compresses the country into a single working day. In Canada and Australia, where the crown exists as a constitutional presence but not as an everyday lived proximity, these images can land differently. They can look like the monarchy reminding the world it's still connected, still functional, still real. In Germany, with its post-monarchical identity and strong constitutional culture, the fascination can be cooler, not royal glamour, but institutional design. How does a system maintain continuity? How does it symbolize stability? And in the US, the discussion can swing between admiration and skepticism, because America understands power theater very well, even if it rejects monarchy as a system. That's why this topic isn't trivial. Helicopter movements are one tiny part of a much larger question: how does the crown look like itself in a century that punishes anything that looks out of step? Now, at minute 10 to 11, we need the midpoint escalation tease, the moment where the audience feels the story is tightening. So here it is. The most interesting thing about these helicopter movements is not where they go. It's what they allow the palace to do next. Because mobility changes the tempo of monarchy. It allows rapid response. It allows presence in multiple symbolic locations. It allows the institution to absorb shocks, public, political, even personal, by showing steadiness through action. And if that's true, then the real escalation isn't about a single flight. It's about a system that can shift its posture quickly when continuity is at stake. So the question becomes, what kind of moment would make the palace lean harder on that system? More visibility, more compressed scheduling, more unmistakable, working monarchy imagery. And would we recognize that moment if it arrived, disguised as routine? Hold that, because now we move into the climax zone, the implications. When the king and queen move, it's not only about them. It's about what they represent, a constitutional thread linking past to present, and present to future. That thread has to be reinforced again and again, not with grand announcements, but with repetition. Repetition is how institutions become believable. A monarchy is, in many ways, a repetitive machine. Investitures, audiences, visits, services, patronages. Each one says, the state endures. The nation endures. The crown endures as a symbol above partisan change. And when a helicopter is used, it can intensify that repetition, because it makes the rhythm possible at scale. The institution can be in more places, more quickly, with less disruption. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Now we're at the minute 11 cliffhanger, where we pivot from what it signals to what it protects. Here's the pivot. If helicopter movements help the monarchy project continuity, then what happens when continuity is threatened, not by politics but by time itself? What happens when the institution must show steadiness while quietly accommodating the realities of age, health, and workload? And how much of what we interpret as message is actually the monarchy adapting its logistics to keep the appearance of continuity seamless? That question is delicate, but it's unavoidable, because continuity is not just a story the palace tells. It's a practical problem the palace must solve. And the brilliance, if we can call it that, of the modern royal machine is that it solves practical problems in ways that also reinforce symbolic stability. A helicopter is practical. It reduces strain. It reduces time in transit. It limits exposure to unpredictable crowd scenarios. It can be planned tightly, secured tightly, executed cleanly. And because it looks decisive, it also looks like command, without ever implying political power. That's the sweet spot for a constitutional monarchy: authority without governance, dignity without decree. Now, notice something else. The king and queen's movements are often discussed as personal choices, what they prefer, what they like, what they dislike. But the palace doesn't run on preference alone. It runs on counsel, security assessments, diary planning, optics considerations, and the steady discipline of not making the institution about individual comfort. So when a helicopter is chosen, it's usually because multiple priorities align. And when multiple priorities align, the institution becomes visible in the decision. That's why people feel there's something there, even when nothing dramatic is happening. Because you're sensing the system. Now we approach minute 13 to 14, where we need the third rhetorical cliffhanger, one that keeps us advertiser safe while still raising the stakes. So here it is. If the monarchy's survival depends on signaling continuity while change unfolds, then what is the most powerful signal of all? The places they go, or the way they arrive? Because arrival is theater. Arrival is framing. Arrival tells you what kind of institution this is claiming to be. Carriages say tradition. Cars say modern statecraft. Helicopters say modernity under control, speed, precision, and reach. And if helicopters say that, then the next question is whether the palace is choosing that language more often now for a reason. Is the institution quietly recalibrating how it looks, so that continuity feels compatible with a faster, more anxious world? Now let's ground ourselves again, because this is where conspiracy thinking tries to sneak in, and we're not doing that. We're talking about signals, not secrets. We're talking about an institution whose job is to be interpreted, because national symbols always are. And to keep it real, consider the alternative. If the king and queen traveled slowly, visibly, by road everywhere, every time, the institution would look more accessible, but it would also look less efficient, more vulnerable, and arguably less contemporary. If they traveled invisibly, with minimal public trace, the institution would be safer, but it would also feel distant, even absent. So the helicopter becomes a compromise, visible enough to reassure, controlled enough to protect. And that compromise is what continuity looks like in the 21st century. National identity is woven into these rituals. Now, let's talk about global reaction, because this is where the geo-targeting layer isn't just name-dropping, it's genuinely relevant. In the US, royal movement is often consumed as narrative. What does it imply? What's the mood? What's the symbolism? That narrative impulse can make helicopter use feel more dramatic than it is. In the UK, there's a steadier understanding that the sovereign's movements are part of the constitutional fabric. Even critics often still recognize the difference between the family story and the state role. In Canada and Australia, there's an ongoing conversation about identity, about whether the crown still reflects the national story. When the king is seen working, moving efficiently, appearing in symbolic contexts, it can be interpreted as the monarchy making the case for itself without ever arguing. And in Germany, where monarchy is history rather than living structure, the attention can turn analytical. How does Britain maintain a nonpartisan head of state? How does symbolism substitute for executive power? How does continuity get performed? Observers in the US and UK frame this moment differently, yet the continuity echoes across continents. Canada and Australia see this gesture as symbolic, but Germany interprets it as constitutional resilience. Now we're moving toward minute 18 to 19, where we need safe foreshadow, something that hints at what's ahead without implying scandal. So here's what I want you to notice the next time you see a report about King Charles III and Queen Camilla traveling by helicopter. Notice what's happening in the wider landscape at the same time. Is there a moment of national reflection? A commemorative season? A period of political temperature? A moment when the monarchy is expected to represent unity, endurance, and calm? Because often, the most important signal is not that they flew. It's that they showed up, on time, in the right place, with the right tone. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And here's the minute 19 cliffhanger, the one that should make you sit back slightly, because it reframes everything we've said. What if the helicopter is not the signal at all? What if the real palace signal is the consistency, the unbroken pattern of duty, no matter what else is changing? And if that's the case, then the most meaningful thing isn't the flight path. It's what the flight path refuses to admit, that the institution ever wobbles. Because the monarchy has survived by doing something that's harder than tradition, harder than reinvention. It has survived by making change look like continuity. Now we're in the final stretch, and we need to return to the gravity center, the legacy axis, without preaching. So let's say it plainly. The British monarchy has survived not because it never changes, but because it knows how to signal continuity even while change is unfolding. Every movement, every journey, every quiet decision made behind palace walls is part of a system designed to protect something larger than any single person, the stability of the crown itself. And when we watch those movements carefully, we are not watching drama. We are watching history quietly doing its work. Palace signal. Say it again, and now it feels different, doesn't it? Not a catchphrase. A lens. A way of noticing the institution as it actually operates, through rhythm, presence, and restraint. And now, one last image. The helicopter dips lower, the sound grows louder, and then it's gone, over the trees, past the hedgerows, beyond the camera's reach. For a second, the sky looks empty again, as if nothing happened. But something did happen. An institution maintained its tempo. A head of state stayed on schedule. A national symbol reinforced its continuity through motion. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. And here, in the final minute, we need one more thing, the forward-looking cliffhanger that carries us into the next episode. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you hear that helicopter, whether you're in the UK watching it cross the countryside, in the US catching a clip online, in Canada or Australia reading it as a distant constitutional echo, or in Germany viewing it as a case study in stability, ask yourself one question. What is the palace preparing the public to accept, without ever announcing it? Because the most powerful signals are rarely the loud ones. They're the consistent ones. Palace signal. And if you think this story ends with where the king and queen fly next, wait until you see how the monarchy signals not just movement, but the future shape of continuity itself.